This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Today's episode is part of a series we're producing together with Israel in Depth, the podcast of the Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. The director of the center, Dov Waxman, is joining me again as co-host. He is a professor of political science and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Israel Studies at UCLA. Hi, Dov. Welcome back.
Hello, Gilad.
Our guest today is an American-Israeli journalist and political analyst, formerly an editor for Haaretz and Arab Affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, as well as deputy director of research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy and a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. His first book is now out. It's called Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict, published these very days by Rauman and Littlefield. Oren Kessler. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me.
So many events in the history of 20th century Palestine and Israel were dubbed the ground zero of the conflict. For you, it's the Arab Revolt, the large-scale and protracted uprising of Palestinian Arabs against British rule on the eve of the Second World War. An uprising that also had far-reaching implications on the issue of the nascent Jewish community in the country. Why do you think it was such a momentous event, transcending all others?
So I'm not sure I would say it transcended all others, but I would say it's an extremely formative, decisive, seminal event for the Arabs of this country, for the Jews of this country, and for the conflict itself and attempts to resolve it. And I think it's one that until now has been underexplored, underinvestigated. And one that's been just extremely formative in sort of setting the template for the conflict as we know it today. So in that sense, I think many aspects of the conflict as we know it today were formed in that period. And in that sense, I think it's sort of seminal.
So you mentioned that that this is a seminal event that hasn't received as much attention as many of the other events in the history of the conflict. Why do you think that is? Why hasn't there been, until your book, I believe, any other general interest books on this particular, major event? Why has it been ignored?
It's a very good question. There have been a couple of books in Hebrew. There's been a little bit in Arabic, but not very much. And there have been a couple of very academic books in English, but there's been no sort of general account of this revolt and the effects thereof until now. Now, why is that? As I write in the book, I think for the Jewish Zionist Israeli side, there's a certain, we like to talk about narratives these days. There's a certain sort of narrative arc to the Zionist story, which sort of begins in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, and then goes through the state building of the 1920s and 30s, and then of course the horrors of the Holocaust, and then statehood. And I think, as I write in the introduction of the book, I think a sort of a large scale uprising against that project, an Intifada in effect, it's kind of an unwelcome disruption in that story. It doesn't really fit. And then on the Arab side. And Mustafa Kabha has written about this quite a bit. He's a professor from the Wadi Ara area of Israel and at the Open University. He's written that from a Palestinian perspective, it's in a sense it's much easier to talk about 48, to talk about the Nakba, to talk about things that were done to them, in which they feel that they've been victimized by the Zionists, by imperialism, whereas. In his words, dealing with 1936 to 39 requires a lot more soul searching because, as I'm sure we'll discuss, there was a kind of it devolved into kind of a paroxysm of infighting and violence between Arabs that's a lot more difficult to kind of fit into their narrative, if you like.
Mm-hmm. So before we delve into that, please can you tell us in what ways it was seminal? Again, as opposed to other events, I don't know, the 1929 riots that were dubbed, I think, year zero by Hillel Cohen, historian at the Hebrew University, who was our guest a few weeks ago. I mean, there are many historiographical approaches to the issue. Why do you think it was the Great Revolt was so seminal?
Indeed, Hillel Cohen wrote a book called Year Zero, 1929, Year Zero of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and with no disrespect whatsoever to Professor Cohen, the events of 1929 were violent and horrific, but it was a week of violence. In the case of Hebron, it was a day of violence, in which about 133, I believe, Jews were killed, and a similar number of Arabs were killed by the British. The revolt, by contrast, was a 3-year uprising. It was really an intifada. There's actually a book in English called Intifada Harishona, the first Intifada, about the Great Arab Revolt. So, in that sense, I tend to look at the violence of 1929 as more riots than a nationalist uprising. That's on the Arab side of the ledger. But as you mentioned in your intro, Gilad, the revolt, the sort of Zionist counter rebellion, I think, is an extremely formative and decisive aspect or element of the Zionist story. And I think that's something that's really been forgotten as well. This isn't just an Arab story. It's an Arab story and a Jewish Zionist story.
I want to go back to the way in which this seminal event is or is not kind of commemorated by the Palestinians. Because it's interesting that in many ways this is, as you know, the very first national uprising, the first Intifada. And yet it doesn't seem to feature as this kind of seminal event. Is there any push within Palestinian society today to restore the significance of this event? Is there any commemoration that the Palestinians hold? Is it taught in Palestinian schools? How's it taught?
It actually is remembered by Palestinians, despite what we discussed earlier about the kind of complexity of it and the kind of difficulty of sort of fitting it in the narrative. The heroes of the revolt are very much remembered. Namely, there's a militant leader by the name of Abdel-Rahim al-Hajj Muhammad, and there's a main street in Amman was recently named for him, for example. The Kaduri school in Tulkarm recently had a big event to commemorate his martyrdom. Izzeddin al-Qassam, which is a name we still hear quite often. Of course, that's the Hamas armed wing carries his name. The Hamas rockets carry his name, Qassam rockets. He was martyred in the Palestinian view just before the revolt. So he's kind of seen as the spark that sort of eventually lit the revolt. There are folk songs, Palestinian folk songs that celebrate the revolt. So the sort of the images and the heroes of the revolt are very much remembered. Hajj Amin al-Husseini is a bit more complex, and we can get to that. But certainly the militant leaders themselves are very much a part of the Palestinian pantheon.
So what was it really that in the spring of 1936 suddenly led to this really protracted, a 3-year uprising that was really unparalleled compared to everything, all the other acts of resistance that the Arab Palestinians had against the British before?
Right. So as I mentioned, Qassam was killed by British forces in December of 1935, and that sort of lit a sort of slow burn on the Palestinian Arab side. But then really there are two sort of major events that really marked the beginning of the uprising. On April 15th, 1936, you have to remember, back in those days, there was no coastal road. So if you wanted to go from Tel Aviv or Jaffa to Haifa, you had to go through what we now call the West Bank, through the Nablus area. And so on April 15th of 1936, there was a poultry seller by the name of Israel Chazan from Salonika, from Greece, an old, probably about 70 years old. And he and his driver and one other man were basically making the rounds, buying chickens from Arab farmers in the Nablus area, and they were on their way back to Tel Aviv. Israel Hazan was a resident of Florentine, a Greek neighborhood at the time. And he was murdered the car was stopped, and he and the driver, Tzvi Dannenberg, were murdered by acolytes, disciples of Qassam, okay? In direct retaliation for Qassam's death at British hands. And then 4 days later, we have what became known as the Bloody Day in Jaffa, in which 16 Jews were killed in Jaffa and South Tel Aviv, and a neighborhood that no longer exists called Manshia on the border of Tel Aviv and Jaffa. 16 Jews were murdered on the streets, and that within a few days of that, Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini and some Nablus notables, it's a bit complicated, but essentially some notables in Nablus, and then the Mufti declared something called the Arab Higher Committee. They declared a strike, and the strike and the revolt were in full swing.
So was it a top to bottom sort of act of resistance, or was it really spontaneous and unplanned?
It was the acts of violence were at least in Jaffa were spontaneous. I think the murder of the poultry seller was obviously planned. An ambush was set. But
was it planned as a large scale rebellion,
Right.
or was it just an amalgamation of separate sporadic events that at some point snowballed into?
So much like the first Intifada 50 years later, it was essentially a grassroots, spontaneous outburst of violence that then the political leadership sort of rushed to lay claim to. And so a few days after that Bloody Day in Jaffa, as I mentioned, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, declared this thing called the Arab Higher Committee, which of course he was, he declared that he was the head of. And these quote unquote national committees sprang up all across Arab Palestine, and he kind of claimed ownership and leadership of the revolt and gave it a sort of nationalistic political color.
So I want to ask you about how we characterize this, as a revolt and uprising. One kind of narrative is to focus on the violent attacks. The other, I think, is to focus on the general strike that took place. That, to what extent was it from the outset a armed revolt, or was it not, like in the first Intifada, something that began much more with a series of non-violent collective actions, refusal to pay taxes, general strikes, and only later, as it kind of lost popular support, did it become increasingly violent? And I mean, do we think of it as a revolt, or rather as a non-violent uprising that, like the first Intifada, became more violent over time?
So I think it was both, and it would depend. It would depend who you're asking. It would depend what day of what day and what month you were looking at, and where. Certainly, it was just a single day after the Bloody Day in Jaffa that Arab notables in Nablus declared their local national committee, national in the sense of nationalism, and so it certainly began with violent acts, but it was accompanied in many places and at many times by political action as well. So, of course, the Zionist leadership from the beginning portrayed it as an outburst of terrorism and banditry, and there was no shortage of terrorism and banditry. There's no way to get around that. But of course, there were political demands. There were three major political demands that the Arab Higher Committee declared, which were stopping Jewish immigration completely, abrogating the mandate, ending the British mandate, and declaring an Arab state. And as you mentioned, the strike was, sometimes the strike gets lost in the discussion of the revolt, but it was a 6-month general strike in which essentially almost the entire Arab economy refused to work with Jews and with the British authorities. It was a huge thing and came at tremendous economic cost to themselves. And I think even to this day, it's one of the longest general strikes in history. It was really for the Arabs of this country. It was really there was something they were extremely proud of. It was really a marvel that they were able to hold out for 6 months and to prompt the British to send the a royal commission, which we now know as the Peel Commission. So it was, from their perspective, a tremendous amount of sort of economic self-sacrifice, and one that really yielded results.
The thing about the revolt is that it was against the British rule, the British authorities. Yet, as you say, and you write abundantly in the book, the Jews were on the receiving end quite often of this violence. Can you tell us a bit how this dynamic played out? They were revolting against the British, but killing the Jews.
Well, they were killing both British and Jews. At the end of 3 years, there were more than 500 Jews killed and twice that many wounded, seriously wounded rather, and about 250 British servicemen were killed. By the way, the number of Arab killed was about at least 10 times the Jewish death toll. At least 5,000, perhaps even 8,000. I mean, these are massive numbers. These are the numbers of the Second Intifada, where about the death toll among the Arabs among the Palestinians was about 5,000.
It also lasted about 3 years.
Indeed, indeed. So it was, again, depending on where and when Jews and or British servicemen or political figures were targeted. Of course, in the Palestinian, in the Arab view, the British were sort of the facilitators of Zionism, and I think objectively they were the facilitators of Zionism, no matter what complaints a lot of Zionists had against them. And so in the Arab view, it was kind of a two-headed monster. And if they can bring down British rule, then they won't have to deal with these boatloads of Jews coming in at an ever-increasing pace.
Just going back to the numbers, the high numbers of people killed in this, what attributed for the large numbers of Palestinian Arab deaths and fatalities? Was this British military tactics in responding to this? What kinds of tactics did they employ to result in such a large Palestinian death toll?
So the revolt is often divided up into two phases, and the first phase being the sort of 6 months that led to London sending over the Royal Commission, the Peel Commission, and then the revolt restarts in September 1937 after the report has been released, after the Arab Higher Committee rejects the report, rejects partition significantly. We haven't talked about partition, but this is, of course, the first time that world powers float the idea of dividing up the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean into two states, Jewish and Arab. This is the first time that the term Jewish state appears on the diplomatic agenda in any real way. So the second phase begins in September 1937 with the assassination of Louis Andrews, who's the acting commissioner of Galilee, and he's by far the highest-ranking British official to be killed. He's assassinated while going to church in Nazareth on his birthday. And Louis Andrews was considered a great friend of the Jews, and he's himself a fascinating character. He's sort of a proto-Christian Zionist, but I digress. The second phase begins then, and at that point, the British authorities had come under criticism certainly from the Zionist leadership, but also to a large degree in the UK, that they had gone kind of soft. In the first phase of the revolt, they hadn't really exerted the full might of British forces. And in fact, the High Commissioner, Arthur Walkup, was personally blamed for having been soft on terrorism. And he was replaced. A new High Commissioner was brought in, a man by the name of Harold McMichael, who was sort of a no-nonsense kind of guy, where Walkup was considered kind of sentimental and a bit past his prime. And particularly after the Munich crisis is averted and Britain sort of is able to breathe for a moment and say, okay, the world war is not on our doorstep, then they send very large amounts of troops to Palestine, about 2 divisions. We're talking about 25,000 men. And they crush the revolt fairly, you choose your adjective, but fairly firmly, and employ some pretty heavy-handed measures, including measures that we're very familiar with today: home demolitions, administrative detention. These are all methods that were first used in Palestine, at least during the revolt. And also importantly, the British massively trained and armed the Jews, and this is something that's often forgotten. The British, starting in the first phase of the revolt, but particularly in the second, they train and arm something like 15 or even 20,000 policemen who are known in Hebrew as notrim, Jewish supernumerary police, because simply put, it's a lot cheaper to give a Jew a gun than to bring over a Tommy from the UK to bring over British troops. British troops were needed in Europe certainly as long as the Hitler menace continued to loom. And so, in the face of this Palestinian violence, the British acceded to a long-standing Jewish demand to train and arm them. And as you can imagine, the weapons were coming from the British government or from the Palestine government, the training as well. But these men were essentially working for the Haganah, namely the Jewish pre-state militia. And the British very much sort of turned a blind eye as long as they didn't act out and behaved. And so by the end of the revolt, you have something like 20,000 Jews who have been trained by the premier military of the world.
So to what extent do you see this period as a prelude to 1948, in both for the Arabs, it left them crushed and demoralized, depleted, divided, and the Jews who had worked on and significantly improved the military capabilities. So was it really the result of the 1948 war? Can you say that it was already written in 1938, 1939?
I could, and I do in the book, and not just me. Rashid Khalidi, the Palestinian American professor, has made that point as well. He refers to what happened to the Palestinians from 1947 to 49 as a postlude or an epilogue to what happened between 1936 to 39. So as much as the Jews obviously suffered in terms of blood and treasure in many ways, David Ben-Gurion, who even at this time was the uncontested leader of the Jews in Palestine and Eretz Yisrael, Ben-Gurion was extremely good at turning misfortune or adversity into gains, into achievements, and not just militarily, but economically. Ben-Gurion had this objective of creating a self-sufficient Jewish economy, and that was given a huge push by the revolt. And even I write about just psychologically the sort of the Zionist ethos very much changed as a result of this revolt. There's one academic book about this period that's called The Abandonment of Illusions. And this kind of fairly widespread perception that among the Zionists that, if we just show the Arabs all the blessings that we're bringing, and if we just give them better tractors and show them, they'll see that we're bringing blessings upon them. So that perception or that illusion was dashed by the revolt. And the kind of defensive ethos that was the mainstream ethos. There were always, of course, we haven't talked about the Irgun, the so-called national military organization. There were always dissenters who wanted a more aggressive approach. But the mainstream ethos at this time among the Zionists sort of switched from a defensive to an offensive ethos, and from idolizing the farmer and the worker to now idolizing the Hebrew fighter. So in that sense, it's a huge shift, and really, in 1939, as World War begins, the Jews have essentially created the military, the economic, the political, the demographic, territorial basis or springboard for, of course, what we all know they did in 1948.
So, what legacy do you think it had for the Palestinian national movement? I mean, in terms of not simply the deportation of many of their leaders and the deaths of many Palestinians, but in terms of their national movement, was it? I mean, I notice you've been referring to it as an Arab revolt rather than a Palestinian revolt. Would you say that this uprising kind of brought about a greater consciousness of Palestinian national identity? Did it change the nature of their demands in the way that it did among the Zionists?
It was certainly, on the Palestinian side, it's really the mirror image of all those sort of positive results that I mentioned for the Jews. I mean, as Gilad mentioned earlier, it really the Palestinian social fabric was completely torn by this revolt. What started off as a source of great pride devolved into just tremendous infighting, and the society was just completely broken economically, militarily, socially. There was just massive amounts of bad blood within the Palestinian society. In terms of terminology, as I write in the introduction, I don't typically use the term Palestinian on its own, simply because at the time it was a term that tended to be applied both to Arabs and Jews. So, it was much more common at the time to say, the Arabs of Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs, the Palestinian Jews. It's not any kind of political statement or anything. Obviously, since 47, 48, 49, they've been known as Palestinians, but that's a separate conversation. It was the revolt was absolutely an extremely formative event for Palestinian nationalism. There's no doubt about it. It was the crucible in which really all elements of society came together, at least at first. Urban and rural, rich and poor, rival families, they all came together against this common foe. To an extent, even Muslim and Christian, although the Christian participation was always a bit more hesitant. There were Christians who joined the strike. There were very few Christian militants. So in that sense, essentially, almost all of Palestinian Arab society came together against these two common foes, and under the Mufti's leadership. Again, at least in those first 6 months to a year. So in that sense, it's remembered, at least that initial stage, as kind of a golden era of unity. And even more recently, even in the 2021 war, in the Gaza war, in May 2021, you'd have there was a 1-day strike among Palestinians, if you guys remember. And social media was just abuzz with comparisons between then and 1936.
So why did it degenerate? I mean, it starts off as this great, unifying collective experience for the Palestinians. But as you know, it degenerated into internecine kind of conflict and violence. And, there are parallels with what took place during the first Intifada and the second Intifada, what we call the first and second Intifada. What accounts for that, do you think? Why did it go from being this unifying event to something that ultimately factionalized and fractured Palestinian society?
I think much of it would have to be laid at the feet of the Mufti. Not all of it by any means, but the Mufti was fairly uncompromising in terms of making sure that everyone adhered to his line. Nobody dared testify to the Peel Commission, for example, until he decided, you know what, okay, we can do that. And then then some people did. At every step, and he was very clever about it, and he was good at covering up his tracks. But it was fairly clear to British intelligence and the British Army that it was the Mufti who was sort of giving the green light to and facilitating the transfer of arms from his. I should mention that when the second phase of the revolt begins, the Mufti flees from Jerusalem to Lebanon. And,
dressed as a woman, I believe.
There are conflicting reports of whether it was a woman or a Bedouin. I believe I'll have to check my book later. I think it was a woman. He sort of sets up shop outside of Beirut, and from there continues to lead the revolt, militarily, financially, politically. And so it was fairly clear to the authorities at the time that it was the Mufti who was running things and who was keeping everybody in line. Anyone who even thought about perhaps calling it a day, or about reaching some kind of resolution, or accepting the various offers that the British made, whether that's the Peel Commission or the White Paper, which we haven't talked about, in 1939, which severely curtailed Jewish immigration. Anyone who thought about acceding to those offers, he would very quickly snap into line, or have his his henchmen assassinate that person. So again, there aren't many smoking guns showing him ordering assassinations, but it was fairly clear to everyone who was pulling the strings.
While we're on the Mufti, it's really interesting the way the personalities, especially on the Arab side, that feature in this story. I mean, on the Jewish and British side, most of them are political leaders and officials. On the Arab side, alongside the Mufti, who was, of course, the supreme religious and political leader at the time, you focus, or two men feature in this book, Musa Alami and George Antonius, who were intellectuals. Not necessarily, I mean, they were, of course, they dabbled in politics, but they weren't like political leaders per se. What do you think is, why did this happen? Like, why did you make this choice to focus on the Arab side onto intellectuals, and what aspects does it add to the story?
I thought both of those characters, Musa Alami and George Antonius, they both struck me as very sympathetic in their way, and very approachable to an English speaking or English reading audience. I could have focused on militant leader Abdul Rahim al-Hajj Muhammad or on Qassam, but first of all, there's much more material in English on these two, and they're very quotable. I thought they'd be very approachable to an English audience, and very complex. They're two very complex characters, both of whom are sort of marginal in their ways, and that they're both very enmeshed in the Arab world, but also they're both Cambridge men. They both work for the Mandate authorities for years. Yeah, they just struck me as extremely compelling. And Alami in particular had this way of always sort of being close to centers of power while also maintaining a certain independence, which I found very interesting.
If I can just return to a very interesting remark you made earlier about the lack of involvement of Christian Palestinian Arabs in militant activities. Is this, I mean, one of the kind of big debates, I guess, about Palestinian nationalism and the revolt at this time is the role that religion plays. I mean, is this, you mentioned the Qassam, who's obviously an Islamic preacher. Was religion part of this uprising? I mean, was that the reason why there wasn't much Christian militancy, or was this largely a secular uprising? I mean, the individuals, obviously, George Antonius is kind of thought of as a more secular Palestinian intellectual.
Yeah, Antonius, of course, was Christian, was Greek Orthodox, from Lebanon originally. The militants were overwhelmingly not just Muslim, but there was very often there were Islamic overtones or undertones to a lot of the rhetoric. That said, of course, George Antonius, of course, politically was of course in favor of the revolt, and was quite close to the Mufti, actually, despite being a Christian. They would meet regularly. Certainly politically, it was in terms of Palestinian Christians, it was sort of a mixed bag. There's a quote that I found, or a letter I found, from a guy named Yusuf Hanna, who was editor of Philistine newspaper in Jaffa, the leading Arabic paper, and he corresponded at length with a guy named Joseph Levy, who was the New York Times correspondent, who was Jewish and a Hebrew speaker and an Arabic speaker, but anti-Zionist, and their correspondence is fascinating. And at one point, Yusuf Hanna says to him, "Look, there's not a self-respecting Arab in this country who wants to be ruled by Jews, but there's also not an Arab worth his salt in this country who wants to be ruled by terrorists." Right? Talking about the Mufti, essentially. And so I think a lot of Christians felt a little bit torn, but on the whole, I think, they probably, a lot of Christians would have wanted the mandate to continue, if at the risk of speculating. I don't think there were a whole lot of Christians who were on board with the Zionist enterprise necessarily, but a lot of them saw the British authorities as kind of their protectors. And I think a lot of them were wary of who might rule an Arab Palestine, because the obvious person would have been the Mufti. So in a sense, they were on board politically, many of them, with the revolt, but with certain reservations, shall we say. But there are a lot of images of children in Bethlehem, sort of cheering on the militants, and Bethlehem was almost entirely Christian at this point. So I don't want to give the impression that they were not in favor of the revolt, but there were more asterisks and there were more caveats there on the Christian side.
I want to ask you to go back to a question Dov asked you in the beginning of this conversation about this being one of the first, if not the first, general interest books about the revolt, especially in English. And as opposed to that, historical writing on that period is copious. And in full disclosure, it's also my field in history. Maybe I'm asking you here to toot your own horn, but what do you think is really the added value of a general interest book about history in general and the history of this place in particular?
Well, it may be a bit of a cliche, but I do think that that understanding the past helps illuminate the present. I think understanding how, as I argue, many of these very formative events help explain or help us understand our present. I don't necessarily think history needs to offer practical lessons for the present, but I dare say I think this one has, if not lessons, at least certainly helps illuminate. I think when we're looking at everything from Jewish military power, when we think about what that means, when we look at Arab or Islamic terrorism, when we look at Jewish terrorism, there had been some scattered acts of Jewish attacks against Arab civilians before the revolt, particularly by the Irgun, which I mentioned. But in the revolt, there were dozens, and this is we're talking about bombs being laid in markets. I mean, this is really, I had no idea about this stuff until I started researching this book. But I think these are really big issues when we think about partitioning the land, when we think about the whole notion of a Jewish state. I mean, these are terms that first came up in the late 1930s, and just lastly, the white paper of 1939 was essentially closed the last door that was available to the Jews of Europe. So this is probably hundreds of thousands of Jews. Again, this is speculation, but
the white paper restricted immigration quite severely.
Exactly. So just I mean, it's an incredibly momentous decision that the British made, an incredibly significant historical decision to close that outlet. So I think it's I think in all these ways it can help sort of illuminate all that's come since.
All right, Oren Kessler, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And many thanks to you too, Dov.
Thank you, and thank you, Oren, for bringing the legacies of this important era to our listeners. I think it's a fascinating conversation.
And big thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here, goodbye.